Thanks, Claire. Welcome, everybody. Well, I'm an academic. I've been studying nationalism and researching on it for about 30 years. The question here is the nation state back? And I'm going to do the old media training thing and talk about sort of what I want to talk about, which is actually close, but not the same. Is nationalism back? Because actually, nationalism often tends to arise when the nation state actually is in some way under threat. So the question for me, is nationalism back? I think the answer is yes. And I'm going to focus on the West in particular. I think the reason we're seeing the rise of national populism is actually not because political sovereignty is really under any great threat in Western countries. I don't think it's a political nationalism. It is very much a defensive cultural form of nationalism. That is, cultural identity of nations is under threat. And this is focusing in particular on the issue of immigration. And why immigration is important is because immigration is connected to the quite transformational ethnic and religious changes that are occurring in Western countries. So I'm going to focus on this aspect of the nation. First thing to say, just a few quick things. A place like Britain, it's not just a civic nation. It is also that. It is also about British values and the monarchy and these very inclusive political traditions, although clearly some people would dissent from even those traditions. But it is also about many of the background characteristics we heard from Bruno about, sports and music, the landscape, the history. But in addition to that, also the ethnic and religious composition of the country. Not saying homogeneity, I'm not saying turning clocks back, but the ethnic and religious composition of a country is part of the unofficial texture of the nation. And it matters. The people who say it doesn't matter at all actually are wrong. And in fact, if we want to understand national populism, this is probably the central thing that's going on in all Western countries. The other thing to say is that nations are not singular. There are competing national identities within countries. So I'm from Canada, and our illustrious former prime minister, who apparently is going out with Katy Perry, was audacious enough to say Canada has no core culture or identity. Now, what's he doing there? What Trudeau is doing is actually saying, oh, we're the most morally virtuous country on earth. So it's actually a form of moralistic progressive nationalism. That kind of national identity is held by a minority, but often a very influential elite minority in all Western countries, very dominant in elite institutions. Against that, you have a more popular, more ethno-traditional form of nationalism that is more rooted in traditional understandings. And again, those unofficial understandings include ethno-religious composition, not to the exclusion of minorities, but the understanding is there's a majority, there's a minority. This has been the tradition. Its erosion or its rapid transformation is causing unease, which is a major driver of national populism. Now, I want to then talk about something which I think is a real impediment to talking about these difficult issues and to actually getting at what is perhaps driving the far right. And that is this issue of what's known as the fallacy of composition. So if you think about it, if I say the NHS isn't working very well and someone says, how can you criticize doctors and nurses? Actually, they're separate things. The NHS is at the aggregate level, at the emergent level. Doctors and nurses are the individual level. Similarly, if I was to say that, there are problems with the military, oh, how can you criticize soldiers? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about a system level, not the individual level of the soldier. Or if I say immigration needs to be reduced, and someone says, how can you be so critical and nasty to immigrants? No, I'm not talking about individual immigrants. I'm talking about immigration as a collective phenomenon. And you're committing what's called the fallacy of composition by trying to reduce it to the immigrant and saying something nasty about an immigrant. Every immigrant could be incredibly virtuous. If we brought 10 million of them in, it would be a disaster. So immigrant and immigration are separate things. And likewise, if we talk about, there's, again, Canada, home of wokery, we have immigration ceremonies where an immigration judge will say, all accents are Canadian accents. Well, that's true at the level of the individual. All individuals, they've got their citizenship. They're all attached to the country. They speak in many different accents. At the level of the individual, it is true that all accents are Canadian accents, all accents are British accents. But at the level of the collectivity, that's a ridiculous statement. There's a Canadian accent, there's a German accent, a Chinese accent, they're separate. And I would say the same thing here about ethnic and religious composition. Rishi Sunak, in my view, is English. despite his religion, despite his race. Um, that's fine. Anyone of any background can be English. But what about England as a whole? If England transforms to become a majority non-Christian, non-white British society, is it as English as it was? No. In my view, it isn't. That's the collective level. That doesn't mean I'm saying Rishi Sunak is less English than anybody else. We need to be able to distinguish these two things. Now, out of that comes another thing, which is that actually the ethnic and religious composition of the nation is a tradition that belongs not just to white British people who are Protestant. It belongs to Rakib or Ada. It belongs to minorities. And interesting, when we look at opinion surveys, Ada mentioned, in Britain, British Sikhs are as attached to that majority ethnic composition as white British Brexit voters. You can look at Canada, where ethnic minorities are as likely to say that the immigration flow has been disproportionately slanted to non-European sources. They are more likely than white Canadians to say that. In the United States, Hispanic and Asian Trump voters are as likely as white Trump voters to say that the European Christian heritage of America is important and under threat. So what I mean here is that to try and avoid these conversations about immigration and ethnic change, to expect that that's going to be the way to go, I think is a huge problem. We're going to have to address the trap of the fallacy of composition. That now, again, there's going to be this temptation to say that's ethno-nationalism. It is not ethno-nationalism is to say you have to be white to be British. That is rejected by over 90% of British people. However, the idea that the ethnic composition can change rapidly overnight, that doesn't matter, I'm sorry, that's just not right. It is important, and it's not only important to white people, it's important to minorities as well. So I would just here's a plea to actually start to get past that fallacy of composition and to talk about these tricky issues. That's going to require a lot more maturity. It's not going to happen in our elite institutions, but hopefully it can happen somewhere. Otherwise, we're just going to get radicalism on the right, and we're going to get the elites talking about esoteric issues that really are tangential to the questions that are really dividing, I think, Western publics. Thank you. Thanks, sir.